30 years have now passed since the USSR collapsed. The largest state in the history of the world has left a mixed legacy, and much of the promise of perestroika era has never been fulfilled. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has touched upon the collapse of the USSR multiple times, and the wider public has strong feelings on the subject. The latest VTS-IOM poll shows that 58% want to see the former giant country unified. Almost unanimously, they believe that in 1991 there was a chance to keep the Soviet Union as a single economy and political space. To this day, the history of its breakup remains relevant to the people in Russia and the former Soviet republics, as the end of a strict dictatorship also signaled national revivals. Despite their dominant role in the USSR as the largest member state, this applied to Russians as much as any other of nationalists in the Union. Perhaps even more so, as Russian identity was suppressed by the Bolsheviks. Indeed, nobody from Moscow or St. Petersburg ever led the Soviet Union, and the two longest serving heads of state during the period were Georgian Joseph Stalin and Ukrainian Leonid Brezhnev. While many were left behind by transition to capitalism, and the 1990s was a decade of Great Depression, it can be argued that Russians have never been as free or as prosperous as they are today. Also, the fact that Moscow no longer has to subsidize socialist parties throughout the world, or as many poorer far away republics, has had obvious financial benefits. Russian philosopher Vasily Rozanov died of hunger in Sergiyevsk Posad near Moscow less than 18 months after the October Revolution. He never accepted the Bolshevik coup and the toppling of Tsar Nicholas II in February 1917. Holy Wars fell to pieces in 3 days. Rozanov wrote about the death of the monarchy. Ironically, a similar sentiment will be shared by the descendants of the Bolsheviks some 70 years later. 16.5 million members of the Communist Party, years of nurturing the new Soviet man, absolute state control over law enforcement and security agencies. Nothing could prevent the collapse of the regime known as the Red Empire by both its citizens and the numerous Russian migrant communities. The 70-year ended Muscovites of 1917 would have had little trouble understanding the feelings of their 1991 counterparts. They too lived through a tumultuous time, feared the uncertain present, and looked into the future with hope. All of the outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the loss of territory, is the first that comes to mind. Russia found itself surrounded by independent states, each requiring its own foreign policy approach. Moscow's territory shrunk back to its 17th century border. Not all the republics wanted to distance themselves from Russia. On March 17, 1991, 9 out of the 15 republics held a referendum on the future of the Soviet Union. 76.4% voted to stay. Even in Ukraine, with its active dissident and anti-Soviet move, 70% of the people supported this decision. The dissolution of the once united country has made the Russians the most numerous and divided people in Europe. Political analyst and philosopher Alexei Zemat, in his interview to Aruti, said that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, many Russians were stripped of their rights in new independent states. They have been losing their social status and influence in the last 30 years. As Soviet Union was formed, and administrative borders rarely matched national ones. Belarus and Ukraine were given entire regions by the Bolsheviks, while some Central Asian nations required statehood for the first time in their history. This resulted in numerous cross-national conflicts that accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nagorno-Karabakh, Transnistria, and Abkhazia, the Fergana Valley riots. Russians have become the largest national minority in Ukraine, 22% of the population in 1991. Kazakhstan, 37%. The Baltic states, 30.3%. In Estonia, 33.8% in Latvia, and 8.6% in Lithuania. Kyrgyzstan 21.5% and Moldova 13%. These issues persist to this day. Many Russians in the Baltic do not have citizenship in their countries of residence. They are treated like second-class subjects and banned from certain professions and cannot participate in political life. The Donbas War have been in many ways rooted in national policies of the first Soviet leaders. The Russian community of Kazakhstan had its share of hardship too, when in summer in 2021, local nationalists organized language patriots and forced service workers to apologize on camera for using the Russian language. Still, in some way, Russia was able to benefit from the collapse of the USSR before the dissolution. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was the strongest economy in the Union. In 1990, it accounted for 60.33% of the aggregate GDP, followed by Ukraine with 17.8%. The USSR subsidized all their republics, including Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, which were all industrial powerhouses in their own right. However, Russia's own population did not fare particularly well. The fruits of its labor were redistributed among other less developed republics. Gaining independence cut them off Russia's balance sheet. So the country was able to focus on its own development and start investing in itself. According to Executive Director of the International Monitoring Organization, CSI, EMO, Stanislav Boychuk, PhD, it was the "Stop Feeding of the Other Republics" slogan that brought enormous popularity to Boris Yeltsin. The ultimate question of why the Russians refused to save the USSR from collapsing boils down to the fact that they essentially had to save it from themselves, from their own dissatisfaction with Russia's status as a financial backer for the entire Union. Boychuk said, the expert believes that in the hypothetical scenario where the Soviet Union survived after 1991, it is likely that Russia, which was already struggling economically, could have been simply overwhelmed by pressure to bankroll the other republics. People who blame everything on the wide 1990s tend to forget that the standard of living has started falling long before the dissolution of the USSR, a factor that had in many ways contributed to the collapse, said Boychuk. The Soviet national policy, which discriminated against the Russian people, was finally gone. The Bolsheviks had tried to create a new ethnicity, the Soviet people, with Russians as the most numerous serving as its foundation. To do this, the Bolsheviks suppressed their identity so they could glue together all other nationalities that were able to raise their own intellectual elites, create their alphabet and national culture thanks to the Bolsheviks. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian culture restored its status and could finally move forward. In an interview with RT, Boychuk explained that the Soviet nationalities policy closed off some parts for Russian national development while opening up others. The concept of a greater Russian nation, heavily promoted in the final decades of the Russian Empire, was replaced by the concept of fraternity of Eastern Slavic people, united but different. The experts believe that for the Russians in the USSR, just as for the Serbs from the former Yugoslavia, one's ethnic identity did not contradict the notion of civil identity as a Soviet person or a Yugoslavian. However, Boychuk noted, Bolsheviks' ideology stated that non-Russian people of the USSR were first supposed to self-identify with the help of the state as independent nations, and then, as it were, realize the need to abandon one's narrow national identity in favor of the all-Union one, and ultimately identify with the world proletariat. That didn't work out, he said. The breakdown of the unified political space wasn't just a matter of culture and ethnicity. The entire Soviet economy was based on the concept of division of labor. Specialized industrial clusters were distributed across the Union. So the dissolution meant losing major industrial centers, production of rockets and aviation engines, and left with Ukraine, part of the automotive sector, with the newly independent Latvia, and Baikonur Cosmodrome ended up in Kazakhstan. The Russian economy faced a number of other challenges after the collapse of the USSR. Former Communist Party member and ex-director of Enterprises actively participated in the privatization, which resulted in wide capitalism taking a grip of Russia from the very beginning. Oligarchs formed entire business empire, fusing them with a weakened central government. This did not add to the stability of the state. The problem was dealt with by as late as the mid 2000s. Other former Soviet republics, Ukraine included, faced similar issues. In Ukraine, however, oligarchs maintain a strong influence on politics to this day. People line up for grocery during the time of the Soviet Empire. Eventually, Russia became these transitional pins. Today, the country boasts of socially oriented economy, harbored with considerable state participation, and developed financial and IT sector. On average, Russians are 1.5 times wealthier than the USSR citizens before the collapse, according to official statistics, which generates underestimatory finances in the former USSR. Still, the inequality brought about by capitalism remain high. But there is another post-Soviet malady that can be traced to the economy crisis of the 1990s. The Soviet Union has invested heavily on socialist movements around the world. Socialist countries in Asia and Africa received loans and were able to get goods and reduce price. Moscow provided them with experts and supplied all necessary equipment. Eastern Europe countries also received help. Massive amounts of money were spent. Economic problem of the 1990s and the transition period undermined Russian influence in those countries. Money and effort ended up being spent for nothing. To Mikhail Gorbachev, promises were enough, so he did not demand any legally binding guarantee from NATO not to expand to the east. As the Socialist Republic in Eastern Europe fell and the Soviet Union had to withdraw its troops. Surely enough, the promises were quickly broken. Many former Soviet nations joined the bloc, granting direct access to the Russian border. This remained one of the key national security issues for the Russian government, and it will decide the nature of Russian relations with the West and former Soviet Republic for years to come. In many ways, it was the desire for NATO membership that led to conflicts with Ukraine and Georgia. Zema pointed out that the dissolution of the USSR dealt a serious blow to Russia's global influence and escalated a number of conflicts along its border. According to the experts, Moscow had to build a new security system, and the process is not completely over yet. Russia has definitely benefited from the fall of the Iron Curtain. The people were allowed access to Western culture and technologies, and were able to join the scientific discussions of international academia. Contemporary Russian culture has been recognized in the West, but there has still been a political rapprochement. When the Soviet Union was in its last leg, there were talks about the common European home, with Russia as an integral part of the new concept. The vision Charles de Gaulle had of a greater Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok appealed to Gorbachev and his government of a newly independent Russia in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Some even suggested that Russia should join NATO to help fight global terrorism. Zeman thinks that it was Gorbachev's short-sighted policy that led NATO to believe that it was free to do as it wished, and its activities didn't have to abide by any law. Integrating former Soviet Republic into NATO's sphere of influence definitely threatens Russia's security, he commented. But as soon as Russia overcame the crisis in the 1990s, rebuilt its economy and became active on the international stage, the world immediately reversed to a bipolar system. All ideas of rapprochement were abandoned. Western politicians were viewed as the heir to Soviet Union that sought to expand its ideology and political system to the rest of the world. Dominants believe that restoring national ideology in its Soviet form is completely impossible today, since the information space is very diverse and numerous ideas are constantly competitive. However, he is convinced that Russia, just like any other country, must have its own paradigm and that would define the country's global interests and understanding of justice, name its potential allies, and describe its worldview. This would be our core, our foundation, but others shouldn't be pressured into it. It must be promoted through soft power mechanism, he added. That's how Russia could explain itself and action to the world. Bishop believed that the absence of ideology in modern Russian politics is a major advantage. Some are the opinion that Russia is in dire need of some kind of grand overarching idea, and by extension, some self-imposed global mission or duty. The opinion is based on nothing but ideological preference of the people expressing it. Bishop argued that The left sees Russia as a country that champions a fair multipolar international order. The right sees some elements of conservative rhetoric and politics, while the Kremlin is trying, with varying sources, to reconcile the red and the white aspects of Russia's historical experience. Naturally, Moscow relies on certain ideological notions in domestic and foreign policy now and then, but that's an ad hoc approach. It depends on the situation, said the expert. Russia has changed a lot over the past 30 years. It is no longer a state with a strict ideology. Moscow foreign policy have nothing to do with spreading a global revolution or communist idea. Russia's diplomats are pursuing a political and economic goal that deals with national security, scientific and economic development, and protecting the Russian-speaking population of the former Soviet Union. For Russia, its main lesson of the 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union is that it does not want to restore the communist system, but it cannot completely renounce its past too. Russia's current political and economic system is much closer to that of the Western idea compared